more than you'll ever know. People always wanted to paint us as enemies, but we were actually very, very close friends.
At 76, Ric Flair breaks a silence about Hulk Hogan's death, and what he says has left fans stunned. This isn't the farewell anyone expected. No soft tribute, no carefully crafted nostalgia. Instead, Flair delivers a raw and deeply personal truth that's dividing the wrestling world. But it's what he allegedly said in private that really set things off. Fans are furious. Insiders are whispering, and the legacy of one of wrestling's biggest icons suddenly feels more complicated than ever. Why now? And why this message? You're about to hear the version of the story no one else is willing to tell. The weight Hogan carried. In the final month of his life, Hulk Hogan didn't look like the towering icon millions remembered from the golden era of wrestling. He wasn't posing in the ring or hyping up crowds anymore. Behind closed doors, the man once hailed as the strongest in the business was quietly falling apart. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, it was all catching up to him. At 71, Hogan had endured more surgeries than some hospitals see in a week. His back had been opened up 11 times, both hips replaced, knees battered, shoulders reconstructed. And just months before his death, he underwent a delicate neck procedure that left him with limited mobility. Painkillers, therapy, discomfort, those weren't occasional hurdles. They were his daily routine. According to reports, Hogan rarely complained to public. But those closest to him saw a different side. He was tired, not in a passing casual way, but in a way that went all the way to the core. Friends say he struggled to get out of chairs without help. He stopped attending many wrestling events. Not because he didn't want to, but because walking across a room had become a chore. And then there was a leukemia, chronic lymphocytic leukemia. To be exact, it wasn't widely known. Hogan had kept it private, preferring to let the world remember the version of him in red and yellow, not the man quietly battling a disease that drained him behind the scenes. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want pity. But he knew the end was inching closer. His final days were spent mostly at home in Clearwater, Florida. He reportedly rejected any dramatic hospital stays. No press, no drama, just quiet. That silence, though, didn't mean peace. It meant isolation. One friend described his last few weeks as haunting, not because of any dramatic event, but because of how still everything had become. For a man whose life had been defined by noise, cheering fans, roaring arenas, explosive interviews, his final chapter was marked by stillness. And maybe that was the part that hurt the most of those who knew him. The quiet, the absence, the realization that the man who once embodied American heroism, strength, and resilience was now barely able to lift his arms without wincing. Some say Hogan had made peace with it, that he saw it coming, that he chose to go out on his own terms without turning it into a media circus. Others say he withdrew because he couldn't face what had become a shadow of the man he once was. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. When the news of his death hit, it felt sudden to the public. But to those close to him, it was a slow-motion ending they watched unfold for months. He died of a heart attack. But that final moment was just the last crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. His heart, in more ways than one, had taken on more than it could handle. Wrestling fans around the world mourned. Tributes flooded social media. Celebrities shared stories. Fellow wrestlers posted old photos. Everyone seemed to have something to say. And among them was Ric Flair. But while others celebrated the legacy, Flair's tone would soon take a different turn. What came next was not what anyone expected. A history written in sweat and betrayals. Long before tributes and headlines, Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan shared a bond forged in the chaos of wrestling's most ruthless era. Their names were never far apart. Wherever Hogan went, Flair wasn't far behind or ahead. They weren't just icons. They were rivals, allies, competitors, and occasionally enemies. And yet, through it all, they understood each other in a way no one else could. Their rivalry began long before the lights of WrestleMania or the drama of WCW's Monday Nitro. In the 1980s, Hogan was the face of WWF, bringing professional wrestling into mainstream pop culture. Flair, meanwhile, was dominating the NWA as the flamboyant technical genius, the guy who, didn't need bright colors or finger-pointing to steal the spotlight. Hogan was a superhero. Flair was a villain, and the fans couldn't get enough of either of them. It wasn't until the 1990s under WCW that the two finally collided full-time. Their matches were explosive, but the real drama unfolded backstage. According to insiders, Hogan's created control clauses and political maneuvering clashed hard with Flair's traditionalist mindset. They both wanted the spotlight, and there were times it nearly tore the locker room apart. But that tension, that friction is exactly what made their rivalry iconic. Neither man would ever admit it outright back then, but they pushed each other, elevated each other, and even when one walked out of the arena furious, he walked out better than he was before. But it wasn't all business. Behind the scenes, a deeper relationship was forming. Flair and Hogan would eventually find common ground, not in their personas, but in their struggles. Both faced financial troubles at different points. Both dealt with broken families, public scrutiny, health issues, and both had to face the painful reality of their bodies breaking down after decades of punishment. There's something oddly bonding about mutual wear and tear. Flair would later admit that Hogan had helped him more than most people knew. There were times when Hogan gave him money, checked him when others didn't, and defended him when the media turned its back. Even when they weren't speaking regularly, there was still a thread that connected them, and that thread never really snapped. Still, theirs wasn't the story of two best friends sharing retirement cruises. Their relationship remained unpredictable. In 1999, Flair and Hogan had a real-life altercation after a WCW event that nearly ended everything. Flair felt disrespected by how the match played out. Hogan reportedly didn't see the issue. Voices were raised, tempers flared, but as always, time smoothed the edges. In recent years, the tone shifted. They were both older, both worn down, and both carrying visible and invisible scars. Hogan had largely stepped away from the public eye. Flair, on the other hand, remained as loud as ever, still appearing at events, still tweeting, still letting the world know he was alive and kicking. Yet, even Flair had started to slow down. And when news broke of Hogan's death, that familiar fire seemed to dim, if only for a moment, because this loss wasn't just about a colleague or a fellow wrestler. It was about history. Flair didn't lose a friend. He lost a mirror. Someone who reflected both the best and worst of a life lived under the spotlight. And that's why what came next caught so many people off guard. Flair didn't issue a clean-cut tribute or carefully chosen words. What he shared was raw, unfiltered emotion mixed with decades of shared pain, pride, and history. He wasn't speaking as a brand. He was speaking as a man who had run out of people who truly understood what it meant to live that life. And when he finally opened up, it wasn't the kind of message fans were ready for. The survivor's paradox. In the days that followed Hulk Hogan's passing, Ric Flair didn't retreat into silence. He didn't vanish from public view. But something about him had changed. His usual bravado, the energy that fans had come to expect, was subdued. The sparkle in his eye wasn't quite gone, but it was dimmed. And those who know him best say that behind the public appearances and offhand remarks was a man battling something much deeper. Survivor's guilt. Flair has always been a man of extremes. Extreme confidence, extreme charisma, extreme resilience, but also extreme vulnerability. Over the course of his life, he's cheated death more times than most wrestlers have had title reigns. In 1975, a plane crash broke his back and nearly ended his career before it began. In 2017, he was placed in a medically induced coma and given a 2% chance of survival after suffering multiple organ failure. Twice, he's been diagnosed with skin cancer and beat it. He's outlived friends, family, even his own son. So when Hogan, seemingly the larger-than-life figure who appeared almost immune to time, died, it hit Flair in a way he hadn't expected. According to those close to him, he began to spiral emotionally, not outwardly, not in some dramatic breakdown, but in private. There were long stretches of silence followed by anxious rants about aging, legacy, and whether he had said everything he needed to say. More than once, he reportedly confided to friends, "Why am I still here?" Not in a self-pitying way, but in pure disbelief. Because while Hogan had become a recluse in his later years, consumed by surgeries and pain, Flair, 5 years older, still felt physically fine. No aches, no chronic conditions that he spoke of. It was baffling and it scared him. That kind of contrast, the physical decline of one icon and the eerie vitality of another, created a strange kind of imbalance. Flair couldn't make sense of it. He began reflecting publicly on Hogan's pain, not just the physical kind, but the emotional burden of watching his body fall apart while the world expected him to still be the Hulkster. Flair, speaking in interviews, described how hard it had become for Hogan to move, to walk, to live normally, and yet Hogan never asked for sympathy. He chose dignity over spectacle. Even in his final days for Flair, that realization triggered something, a need to speak, a need to confront not just Hogan's death, but everything it represented. Time, legacy, regret. What it means to outlive your peers when your entire identity was built around being one of them. It's no surprise then that his eventual statement would stir emotions. But what surprised people most wasn't that he spoke. It was how he spoke. There was no filter, no publicist smoothing the edges. This wasn't a press release. It was a man laying his thoughts bare whether fans were ready for them or not. And that honesty, unflinching, unpolished, and rooted in decades of shared history, is what set the stage for everything that followed. Because Flair didn't just pay tribute. He told the truth as he saw it. And in doing so, he lit a firestorm, breaking the silence. It wasn't some flashy announcement. No dramatic return to the spotlight. Flair simply spoke publicly for the first time since Hogan's passing. His message was brief but clear. I think he just got tired. 11 back surgeries, 2 hip replacements, a neck surgery. I mean, how much can your body take? He didn't dramatize it. He didn't embellish. There was a tone of resignation in his voice, the kind of weariness that only comes from watching someone close to you slowly deteriorate over time. Flair also added something that caught the attention of many viewers. Here I am, 5 years older than Hulk, and I don't have an ache or pain in my body. That bothers me. And of course, it gives me anxiety that I could be next. The reaction to his public remarks was mixed, but not outraged. Many fans found the statement respectful, even heartbreaking. They appreciated the honesty, the humanity. Flair wasn't performing. He was reflecting. Speaking not as a showman, but as a man who had watched too many of his peers fade away before their time. But that was only the surface. According to sources close to Flair, there was another side to what he'd been saying privately behind closed doors in conversations not meant for the cameras. And when those words began to leak online, everything changed. I can't stay silent anymore, Flair reportedly said to a longtime friend before his public comments. People keep pretending like Hogan went out on a high note. He didn't. He was miserable. He hated being seen like that. Couldn't walk. Couldn't move. That's not how he wanted to be remembered. The remark spread fast. Yes, at 76, Ric Flair broke his silence about Hulk Hogan's death, but what he said made fans furious. To many fans, it was more than just an observation. It was a gut punch. Hearing Flair suggest that Hogan was ashamed of his condition felt like a betrayal of the hero they idolized. It painted a picture of vulnerability they didn't want to see, one that clashed violently with the larger-than-life image of the man who once Bodas slammed giants and told millions to eat their vitamins and say their prayers. Some fans lashed out. Social media threads turned heated. Wrestling forums buzzed with debate. How dare he speak for Hogan like that? One post read, he's supposed to be honoring his friend, not rewriting the ending. Others accused Flair of making Hogan's death about himself, twisting grief into commentary that wasn't his to give. But there was another side, too. A growing number of voices defended Flair, arguing that if anyone had earned the right to speak honestly, it was a man who knew Hogan both in and out of the ring for over 4 decades. To them, Flair's leaked comments weren't disrespectful. They were raw, uncomfortable, yes, but rooted in truth. After all, Flair hadn't trashed Hogan's legacy. He'd mourned the quiet suffering of a man who spent his final years in pain and out of view, far from the limelight that once defined him. The phrase, "I can't stay silent anymore," took on a life of its own. Some viewed it as unnecessary. Others saw it as brave. But no matter the opinion, it sparked a storm. Flair didn't try to calm. At 76, Ric Flair didn't break his silence with a tribute that polished Hogan's memory to perfection. He broke it with honesty, maybe too much of it. And whether fans felt betrayed or seen, the message was clear. Behind the legends, behind the larger-than-life personas, were men dealing with pain, fear, and fading legacies. And not everyone was ready to face that, wrestling with the fallout. The response to Ric Flair's remarks about Hulk Hogan was explosive. There were no dramatic headlines, no viral outrage, no coordinated backlash. It was quieter than that. But in the wrestling community, the circles that really followed these men, that understood their histories, it stirred a deep discomfort, not because of what Flair said publicly, but because of what had been whispered afterward. Flair's official statement had been measured, respectful even, he spoke about Hogan's pain, his surgeries, his resilience. He reflected on how strange it felt to be 5 years older and still physically strong, while his longtime friend had spent his final years in pain. It felt honest, vulnerable. Most fans appreciated that. But the discomfort grew when word of Flair's private remarks began to surface. He had reportedly told a friend, "I can't stay silent anymore," followed by something more blunt. "People keep pretending Hogan went out on top. He didn't. He hated being seen like that. That's what really broke him." No one quoted it in print. It didn't become a headline, but people in the wrestling world were talking about it quietly, carefully, and that was enough. Some felt Flair had overstepped, not because his words were false, but because Hogan never chose to say them himself. If Hogan had felt ashamed of how he looked near the end, if he had chosen to withdraw rather than appear in public, he hadn't made that part of his story. He had never asked for anyone to explain it for him. Flair's decision to fill in that blank, even with the best intentions, made some uncomfortable. Others understood exactly where Flair was coming from. They'd seen the same things. Hogan had turned down appearances in the final year of his life. He avoided cameras. He chose privacy even when it cost him work. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to preserve the image people still had of him, the strong, proud, unstoppable force. Flair's comments didn't undo that image, but they added something real to it, something many people weren't ready to confront. The truth is, there was never going to be a perfect way to talk about what happened to Hulk Hogan in his final years. His physical decline was painful. His health issues were serious. But he kept it quiet. He didn't want the world to see him suffering. And that silence made his death feel sudden, even though it wasn't. Flair's choice to speak about that silence, to break it, even gently made people uncomfortable. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't unkind, but he was direct. And that's something wrestling fans don't always know how to process when it comes to their heroes. They're used to the legend, not the man. They remember the entrances, the promos, the slams. They don't always want to hear about the hospital beds, the isolation, the way someone slowly fades out of the spotlight. Flair didn't try to rewrite Hogan's story. He simply added a chapter most fans hadn't read, one that didn't fit the larger-than-life narrative but still mattered. And while it didn't cause a firestorm, it left people sitting with a new, heavier understanding of what aging in this business really looks like. Among wrestlers, Flair's remarks sparked quiet reflection. Not statements, not interviews, just nods, offhand comments, a few texts exchanged between veterans who knew exactly what he meant. They'd seen it happen to others. They feared it happening to themselves. No one shouted Ric Flair down. But something had shifted. The conversation around Hogan's final years wasn't as clean as it used to be. It had been touched by something honest, even if it wasn't welcome. And for Flair, that was a point. The truth that wouldn't stay buried. In the days that followed, Ric Flair didn't offer any clarifications. He didn't walk back his words. He didn't issue a second statement. Nor did he deny the private quote that had slowly worked its way into the wrestling world's collective memory. Instead, he remained quiet, not in retreat, but in a kind of acceptance. What he'd said was already out there. And more importantly, it was something he believed needed to be said. For Flair, Hulk Hogan's death wasn't just a loss of friend. It was a closing of a chapter in wrestling history, one that no longer had many voices left to speak for it. Most of the icons who once traveled those brutal circuits, who built their bodies into machines and then broke them for the sake of entertainment, were either gone or no longer able to speak. Flair, against all odds, was still standing, still lucid, still able to remember what it all really cost. That's what made his words different. They weren't polished, celebratory tributes designed for public comfort. They came from a man who had lived it, who had seen what the spotlight doesn't show, who had outlived the image. When Flair said, "I think he just got tired," he wasn't trying to minimize Hogan's legacy. He was trying to explain the toll. And when he privately said he didn't want to be seen like that, it wasn't said with judgment. It was said with recognition. Flair had seen that same look in others. He understood what it meant when a man who used to command the world now hesitated to open the front door. He wasn't painting Hogan as weak. He was reminding people that being strong, truly strong, sometimes meant choosing silence, even when your whole life had been built on a roar of the crowd. Still, the discomfort lingered because what Flair had revealed, intentionally or not, was that wrestling doesn't always allow its heroes to age gracefully. It demands everything in their prime, then often leaves them behind when their bodies no longer cooperate. And when those same heroes disappear from the spotlight, it's easier to assume they're simply resting, not quietly suffering. Flair knew that. He'd lived both sides of it. He'd been at the top. He'd lost everything. He'd come back. And he'd buried more friends than he cared to count. That kind of survival comes with a burden, one that doesn't leave room for illusions. Some fans still wish he had kept certain things to himself. Maybe Hogan would have preferred that, too. But if there's one thing Flair never was, it's quiet. And maybe in the end, that was the point. Someone had to say what others were too afraid to admit. That the end doesn't always look like the movies. That sometimes our strongest heroes slip away quietly. Not with final match, but with a closed door and too much pain to explain. Flair didn't say it to hurt. He said it because he couldn't carry it anymore. And as uncomfortable as that truth was, it opened a space for something wrestling rarely embraces. Reflection, not the kind built around highlights or title belts, but the kind that asks what we owe the people who gave us their bodies, their health, and eventually their peace. The red and yellow will always shine in memory. But so will the reality that even legends grow tired, and maybe that too deserves to be remembered. What do you think about Ric Flair's confession? Let us know in the comments.